What's going on, y'all? This is Bud Elliott of the Cover 3 podcast. Welcome into the Bud College Football lunchtime, lunch break hangout thing that we do. Pretty informal here. And joining me once again, Cooper Petanga, our national recruiting analyst, scout extraordinaire for 24/7 Sports. Going with the stash today instead of the beard. I'm liking it, man.
I know. Yeah, I'm worried about what Steve is going to say next week when I show up in Florida with this thing. I'm probably going to have to make some changes.
Now, is this girlfriend approved?
No.
Okay. So she's in protest.
I'm a rebel, man. I'm getting ready to go out on the road, do my own thing.
Nice.
Stash in the wind. You know how it is.
No doubt. Shia LaBeouf lookalike contest. Awesome.
Perfect.
So a couple things have happened since the last time we chatted, which was, of course, last Tuesday. Oklahoma has a coach. Clemson has a coordinator opening. Miami has a new coach. And Oregon has an opening. Try to be hospitable to our guests. Where do you want to start here?
I think, they're all great topics of conversation, but why don't we start with Cristobal?
Yeah. To me, Miami gets a guy who is a really strong recruiter and who is pretty obsessed with recruiting. Just from talking to guys who have been on that staff, like not you, but other guys I knew who coached there, they're like, he's all about recruiting and getting players. And if you want to win at the highest level, as we've talked about on the show many times, you absolutely have to recruit. You can kind of coach your way to nice seasons like a Patterson or D'Antonio or whomever else you want to point to it. If you want to win at the very highest level, it seems like you really do need to get all of that talent. And he has a pretty special affection for that place, played there. Obviously, his brother is still down there. He's related to some big boosters by marriage. His mom is publicly out there that she's in poor health. And so totally understandable to want to get back to your hometown where you played. That has a big opportunity for you and looks to be making some renewed investment in the program.
Yeah, I think that's big. And we'll kind of get in that conversation here shortly with the resources. But, I think for him, it was a really great opportunity to come home. And I don't know if it would have been any job that would have pulled him out of Oregon. I think, eyes were open, ears were open in terms of the opportunities maybe out there. We saw that last year when Auburn and his name kind of got kicked around a little bit. He ended up getting a raise at Oregon. But I think this is a really natural fit for him for a lot of different reasons. But you go to Miami, obviously grew up in that area, played there as well. He holds it in a really high esteem. I don't think this move happens, Mario Cristobal to Miami, without the investment in the program that it looks like Miami is going to make. He's getting $8 million a year. There's more money in terms of the budget that's going to be operating for his support staff and coaching staff salary pool. I think that's big. It looked like they're closing in on the AD from Clemson as well. So I think that alignment, right? We talk about that. That's kind of been the word over the last week or so with the coaching carousel. You hear a lot of these coaches talk about alignment. And what I think that's just a commitment to winning and a commitment to resource. That's an easy translation when somebody throws that word out there. So I think with Mario, even behind the scenes with as much as a mess as it did play out publicly, there was enough relationships there, people that he trusted, that he knew that he was going to be able to get the opportunity that he wanted to go in there, build it over time. He's not in the SEC, he's in the ACC. So I do think that all factors into his decision-making in terms of going down to Miami.
I completely agree with you on that. I mean, So, Coop, not every coach would leave Oregon for Miami, obviously. Like, Oregon's a great job as well. Specifically, I don't know that Cristobal leaves Oregon for Miami if they don't make that investment. I know when Lincoln Riley left for USC, we talked about the importance of paying your support staff and your non-coaching staff enough money to where they can live comfortably and like actually enjoy coming to work. And at USC, obviously, if you pay somebody $60, they got to live pretty far away from campus, especially if they have a family. If you're a single dude, early 20s or something, okay, you managed to score a college apartment, you're probably okay. But if you want somebody who's a little more established, maybe to come on as an analyst or a recruiting director or whatever position you want, and that guy's got a wife and kids, they got to live, 90 minutes out of town at USC. The same thing kind of holds true in Miami. Like, I know here in Orlando, my housing appraisal has gone up 50% in about 2.5 years. So housing costs in Miami are nuts too. You can't pay somebody $50K and expect to get somebody really good who has a family, because they're gonna have to work like, an hour and a half away from the Gables.
Right. And credit to Miami and credit to USC. Look, me, myself included, were very skeptical of Miami in this process. And we talked about Mario Cristobal and Lane Kiffin kind of being the two options that they held in high regard. They went out there, and as much as this played out publicly not the right way, in an extremely difficult situation for Manny Diaz, the former head coach of the Miami Hurricanes, who handled it with class. I applaud Miami for going out there and doing what they need to do to attract a name like Mario Cristobal and making him comfortable in coming. And we talked about it a few weeks back in terms of Miami attracting the type of talent out there in terms of off-field support staff, whether that's in strength and conditioning, whether that's in recruiting, so on and so forth. And having those type of people be comfortable with what they're getting paid in a place like Miami, that should be the case. So I do applaud Miami. I applaud USC for going all in on football. And this was the type of financial commitment it was going to take for them, not only to get a coach like Mario Cristobal, USC with Lincoln Riley, but they were going to have to ante up off the field as well. It looks like both those programs have done that.
For sure. I mean, if Mario wants to implement the Saban style model, that does mean having an army of analysts and assistants behind the scenes to get things done. Nick carries one of the largest staffs in the country, as does Kirby at Georgia. Obviously, Jimbo at A&M has a lot of people. That's just the way that coaching tree kind of wants to roll. Not that others don't copy it too. I mean, certainly people are not going to turn down having more competent staff to help them find gems on the recruiting trail or babysit those gems once they get on campus. If you're Manny Diaz, I certainly understand being frustrated. Not from obviously how they did it to you is, I would say, somewhat unprofessional, but also people suggesting that he should quit out of pride are absolutely nuts. You're not going to walk away from an $8 million buyout just because your pride is hurt for a couple of days. I mean, that is the business. The word was out there that it was going to be Lane or Mario. When it wasn't Lane after the Egg Bowl, it was pretty obvious that their number one guy, as most people believed, was Mario, and they were going to wait for him to turn it down to see maybe they could go to Lane or maybe they would decide to keep Manny. I will say, shout out to David Lake of our Inside the U site. I mean, he was out there on a limb early on this. I mean, weeks ago, like early November. And a lot of people said he was wrong. And other competing sites ran with stuff from sources that turned out to not be in the know. And David had the absolute nuts hand here, and he didn't fold it. He just kind of waited patiently for other people to look foolish. And like, he knew he had the goods and stuck to it and was right every step of the way. So if you guys are Miami fans watching this and you've not subscribed to Inside the U, I mean, the dude is plugged in, right? It's hard to be out there on a limb like that. I know when we were talking about Jimbo leaving FSU at my former site, a couple of years ago now, that was a scary place to be in September. Be like, something's weird here, man. This something's going down. But if you're right, you're right on it. I do want to talk about. So you've worked at Alabama. You've been at a lot of schools that recruit South Florida. How scared are you? Or not scared, but are you reevaluating what you do in South Florida? How much tougher is this going to be to recruit South Florida with Mario there?
I think he's going to do a good job, but at the end of the day, you can take 25 players. There's enough talent. It's one of the most talent-rich states, if not the most talent-rich state in all of America. And I think he's going to do a really good job of attracting and bringing the best talent to the University of Miami. But I think Billy Napier factors into this equation as well. We talked about that budget in terms of the coaching staff and the commitment that he got. I think Billy Napier got $7.5 million invested in that program in terms of salary pool, which would put him right in between Georgia and Alabama. So that's very commendable, which you kind of see why he's been so patient throughout this process in terms of what he's asked for in terms of resources and infrastructure. So I think with those two now in the state of Florida, I think really it's going to be interesting. It's almost too many options, right? And I thought about that during my time at Oregon. You have a lot of people that want to come and a lot of good players that want to come to the University of Oregon. It's going to be no different for Mario Cristobal at the University of Miami and Billy Napier at the University of Florida. So I think it's more about taking a more disciplined approach in terms of the players that you've identified in the cycle, especially from the state that you want to take. And you heard Mario Cristobal talk about it this morning, how pivotal the evaluation process would be in terms of how they want to build their roster off of height, weight, speed. Everybody has that playbook in the state of Florida. You talk about Billy Napier, Mario Cristobal, 2014. They were there together, so they know what it looks like as well. They might be in two different conferences, but it's going to be more highly competitive, and that's the way it should be. And it's going to be interesting to see how that affects the dynamic of some of these programs, the blue bloods that we've talked about the last couple of weeks, who've had a lot of success in the state of Florida. Now those fences are starting to come up. It might not start day one, but over the next 2 to 3 years, this is going to be more and more difficult for teams like Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, who have historically had a lot of success over the last couple of seasons, being able to go into Florida and really build intricate parts of their team around that state.
So, cool stat here. Since Miami won their first one, I think in '81, 1 out of 4 national titles has been won in the sport by a team from the state of Florida. If you're not getting those players in, somebody else is, and they're probably winning titles with them. Whether it's Calvin Ridley or Amari Cooper or Evan Neal is a kid from Florida on the Bama squad this year. Countless guys on Georgia haven't won a title yet, but certainly have assembled a title caliber roster. I was putting the finishing touches this morning on my Sunshine State scorecard piece, which kind of lucky I held it because now it's going to do nice in the search with all the stuff going on in the state. Should do some pretty good numbers. Make sure to check that out on 247sports.com. But right now, only 8 of the 23 players who are committed among the 4 and 5 stars in Florida who are actually from Florida. So I take and strip out the IMG kids who are from out of region, because you don't really have an intrinsic advantage just because they're playing at IMG, because a lot of them, it's a boarding school. They don't have any real ties to the state. But only 8 of those 23 are actually staying home as of right now. So still a lot of work to be done there. I don't think that anybody's going to build a fence around the state of Florida. There are always going to be guys that can go elsewhere. Travel's cheaper now. You can go see it. I think it's more accepted to go out of state, obviously. But if they can get that ratio from more of that kind of 35% range staying in state to more back to where it was just a couple years ago, 50, 55, I think you're going to see much better play from the teams in the state of Florida. If it stays around 2 out of every 3 going, then those Florida jobs aren't that great, right? Like, what makes them so good is the proximity to elite talent. You have to take advantage of it, though.
Right. And I think both those guys have an understanding of that, especially Billy Napier. I mean, looking at the guy that he's following up in Dan Mullen, and we talked about what type of coach Dan Mullen is. Really what led to his downfall is not being able to uphold the standard of Florida recruiting and excellence in the state of Florida. So, look, the other thing is I think, and I talk about Billy Napier equally as in the same category as Mario Cristobal as well. These are going to be dogfights. These guys are going to strain, they grind. Not only do they have the playbook of what it takes in terms of how to build a roster and what that looks like, but in terms of the work, it's going to be a lot more difficult. And that proximity to home is important, because now if you're Mario Cristobal, you don't have to worry about getting guys on campus, flying all the way out to Eugene, Oregon. The proximity in the state of Florida and the University of Miami, being able to get those guys on campus, that now becomes his greatest advantage. So him being able to really get dig in on these guys and get claws in them, I think is going to be huge, and something that we're probably overlooking in the process in terms of regional recruiting, and then in the state of Florida as well. It's not going to be the same, for Alabama and Georgia. Those are the 2 programs that I think will be affected the most by Billy Napier and Mario Cristobal.
And to be clear, they're not going to be scared, obviously. Like, those 2 programs are absolutely humming on the recruiting trail. It's going to be more of an annoyance. Like they're going to have to put more effort in to land these guys. It's more of a dogfight, like you said there. Because we were talking Mario, let's pivot and talk a little bit about the Oregon job, a place that you're very familiar both as a competitor against when you were at Washington, and then also you also worked at Oregon. What from the outside do we not know about the Oregon job? Like what makes it a good job, and what are some things that maybe are issues that folks from the outside might not know about?
Yeah, and I on Twitter yesterday, I kind of commented about it in terms of they need to make that job, talking about the administration more appealing in terms of infrastructure and resources. And I'm not talking about the university as a whole. I'm not talking about Phil Knight and his financial commitment to the university as well. But I think where that has been felt has been in terms of support staff, everything that we talked about. I just got done watching Mario Cristobal's press conference. They asked him specifically about this topic and whether that weighed into his decision or not. And I think it did. Ultimately, was it the reason why he left for Miami? I don't believe so. But it is something at the forefront of his mind and that he's thinking about. And when I say that it's just the depth of the pockets, the depth of the investment. When I got there, I think in terms of the majority of these staffs in the SEC have 5 strength coaches on staff full time. I think at Oregon, we had 4. That was a conversation, right, that had to happen. And to Oregon's credit, they got there, right? And they were working, and they're working to improve this. This is something that I think they're completely, fully aware of. But in terms of that, I got to talk about recruiting, certainly felt it there. Obviously, being the director of recruiting at Oregon, those were conversations that were ongoing in terms of Mario renewing his contract. How would that money filter down to the recruiting staff, creatives, recruiting operations, director of on-campus recruiting? They just finally this past year brought in a director of on-campus recruiting. These are things that you need to be successful at a championship level. And it's really hard. And what I say is Mario is such a talented recruiter. And he did a phenomenal job of recruiting to the University of Oregon because there was nobody within that geographical footprint that was going to outwork him. And Oregon had the wind at its back between the facilities, between Nike. There's a lot to sell there, but there's also a lot to overcome. And I thought this was interesting. Much like Oklahoma, there's a lot of players in prospects out there committed to Lincoln Riley, maybe not committed to the University of Oklahoma. In the similar vein, there's a lot of people committed to Mario Cristobal, maybe not to the University of Oregon. And I think that's going to be something to watch out for over the next couple of weeks in terms of who stays and who goes, and those guys entering the transfer portal. They're not far away by any stretch of the imagination. There's just a commitment that needs to be made in terms of making that a long-term sustainable spot. If Mario Cristobal is sitting there making $8.5 million a year, there's no stress on him in terms of being able to retain his staff. And you look at the high level of turnover. I don't know if people have looked at this, but in terms of support staff at a program like the University of Oregon, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you look, like you said, under the hood, there's a lot of people leaving for a lot of different reasons. And it's not because they're winning 10 plus games a year where you're competing for a Pac-12 title every single year. And this usually does come back to dollars and cents. And I say that like Brian Kelly in Notre Dame. We keep hearing, well, why would he leave Notre Dame? Well, the guy's the most winningest coach in Notre Dame history, and it's still difficult for him to get done the things that he thinks are necessary to get done to compete at a championship level. And then he has somebody like LSU that's going to come out there, shell out $100 million to him, and whatever he asks for, he's going to get. That's the difference. And, these guys at the end of the day, whether it's Mario Cristobal, Brian Kelly, or Lincoln Riley, they want to be able to contend for national championships year in and year out, and they know what that looks like. And it's no different than what Nick Saban has done at Alabama, Kirby Smart has done at Georgia. These guys are smart. They know they're knocking on the door. How do they take that next step? They need the investment. They need the alignment from the administrations, from the boosters, to everybody involved in this process, you got to be all in. And if you're not all in, you really don't have a shot. So I think Mario Cristobal did the best with what he had. I think that's just a conversation that Oregon needs to have with themselves. They have a really good program. They've done a really good job of attracting talent there and really good coaches. But when they're evaluating this situation, all else is equal, how are they going to keep the next guy here from taking the next job? And I think that's what it comes down to. And, we talk about that margin of error. I mean, that line is thin, but really at the end of the day, that might be the straw that breaks the camel's back.
So I got a lot of follow-ups here. First, I think it's interesting, probably because you worked there, that you interpreted the question to Mario in sort of a comparative way, right? Hey, the resources here at Miami compared to the resources at Oregon. Looking at the transfer, I kind of interpreted it as like the resources at Miami now compared to what the resources were at Miami, right? Like the increased investment in Miami. But I think it's fascinating that you're able to take and look at this from an Oregon perspective. So Oregon's a public university, right? So all this is public record. I mean, if somebody wants to go dig it up, they could. But what sort of, as the director of recruiting there, what sort of salary gap were you worried about? Like, is it somebody making, I don't know, 40 leaving for a school that offering to pay him 60, or is, like even lower than 40, or what, because that's the kind of thing. Oregon has a reputation of really paying up, at least among the people who you would think to look at, right? The head coach, and pays the coordinators fairly well, and they have super nice facilities. How big is the gap there that you were dealing with as far as retention of quality people?
It's probably more resource allocation. Like I don't like getting into this conversation. It's maybe not whether or not Oregon has the money. It's
Sure.
where those resources are allocated in terms of the funding. And I think they've done a tremendous job. I think Phil Knight's done a tremendous job in terms of getting that place to a standard where it competes on a national level, where somebody like Joe Moorhead would want to go there. Somebody like Brian McClendon would want to go there. I mean, they've been able to attract names from all over the country. Brian McClendon was making $1 million as the co-offensive coordinator at South Carolina, and then he leaves for Oregon. So I think they've done a really good job in terms of what they've done from a coaching staff standpoint. Infrastructure, support staff, being able to retain people, right? You're in Eugene, Oregon. This isn't Miami. So I think there has to be some conscientious effort to say, hey, we have to be able to acquire, develop, and retain our talent. What does that look like? And competing nationally at the University of Oregon, and where Mario Cristobal had them, which was in the top 10 consistently in terms of a recruiting program, there was a lot that went into it, and there's a lot of demand that goes into it. So I would say the gaps were sizable. And what I mean by that is, even being at a place at the University of Oregon, whether it was in one of these support staff roles, you had to be concerned losing good people to other places that on paper didn't make a lot of sense in terms of those moves. But dealing with what they were dealing with from a financial standpoint, you certainly understood why they would examine that and why they thought that would be best for their future. And we're not talking about a monumental amount of money. We're talking about maybe a $700,000, $800,000, $900,000 increase in terms of just recruiting, but maybe a couple $1 million that needs to go into the program to see this as someplace that people want to be from a support staff level.
I mean, people can't actually live in the building, even if the hours seem like it sometimes, for sure. That's Cooper. I'm glad we get nitty gritty on this show, because that's something I bet you, like, a lot of the people watching here didn't know. Like from the outside, they see the Phil Knight money and the big Oregon money, and obviously the facilities and whatnot, and that Oregon offered Cristobal a package of $8 million a year to stay. Some of those down ballot roles, though, really are important. If you don't have them right, or if you have constant turnover in them, it can make things frustrating. It's also kind of a testament to the job that staff did in putting together top 10 recruiting classes year after year, with dealing with some of the behind the scenes turnover that they did. I'll be interested to see where they go with this job. Right, Cristobal recruited extremely well, and they won the Pac-12 twice, or did they play for it twice?
I lost you, bud.
Oh, sorry, you back?
Yeah, I think so. You got me?
Yeah. I was just saying I'll be interested to see where Oregon goes with this hire. Cristobal recruited extremely well, as you noted. They won what, one or two Pac-12 titles,
2, I
and
believe.
played for a third.
Yep.
Now people will say, "Hey, they wasted Justin Herbert, and they certainly didn't play to a top 10 type level consistently, despite the top 10 recruiting." And that's a fair criticism, I think. Right? Like there were teams in the Pac-12 that certainly outplayed their talent more than Oregon did. But if you don't get the players, you don't really have the ability to even attempt to play at the level that Oregon was attempting to play for. Recruiting and getting those players in is largely the most important thing. That's not to say that coaching doesn't matter. It certainly does. Player development absolutely matters a ton, but you got to get the players in there, and he certainly did that. I don't know where they're going to go with this job. We've heard Chip Kelly, Brian Harsin, Justin Wilcox. I saw on Twitter that they had requested to interview Satake, the BYU coach. All guys who certainly there's a path you can draw that could make some sense. And I'm not really sure any of those dudes would recruit quite as well as Mario and his staff did there at Oregon.
Yeah, I think that's a fair objective of opinion of that. I don't know if you're going to find somebody that's going to recruit or raise the talent ceiling more than Mario Cristobal did at the University of Oregon. Now, that being said, whoever's coming in next, there is a great opportunity in terms of the foundation that he's built with that roster. I mean, you got Ty Thompson, who was a guy who was incredibly highly touted. What they've done at the skill position in terms of some of the younger guys that they have there with Chris Hudson, Troy Franklin, Dante Thornton, so on and so forth, in those rooms are very in a very good position and primed and ready to roll for whoever's next. You heard Mario Cristobal kind of talk about that in his exit interview on the way out, which was pretty unique. But it's interesting, and I think whoever they hire, you talk about the names that they hire, or excuse me, that they're kicking around right now between Chip Kelly, Justin Wilcox, Kalani Sitake, they couldn't be any more different than Mario Cristobal, and he was a ground and pound, in your face, all gas, no breaks, 24/7, 365. And he certainly elevated the athletic profile of that program. But there's going to be a little bit of a culture shock if that is indeed the direction that they end up going, because in a lot of ways they have mirrored an SEC program and how they built it from the ground up, from a talent standpoint and from a cultural standpoint. So it's going to be fascinating to see what direction they go. I've heard Dave Aranda's name thrown out there. I think he'd be a home run hire. But once again, I think, you want to put him in position where you're going to commit to him long-term and give him the resources needed to be a championship contender.
Aranda also really improved as far as some of his on-field coaching from year one to year two. I'm sure some of that was getting an offensive coordinator in Jeff Grimes, who actually came from BYU, who he's more comfortable with operating that offense. But a lot of his in-game decision-making and adjustments this year were just so much better. Initially, I was a little worried. It's like, man, is he really going to coach like a guy who never graduates from a defensive coordinator into a head coach? Almost like a Muschamp did, right? There's just no excuse not to score more points at Florida than they did over the course of his coaching tenure there. And points were really tough to score at South Carolina as well. Some guys just are better as coordinators. Even look at the NFL. Norv Turner, right? Tremendous offensive coordinator, never really could get it all together as a head coach. But Aranda seems to have really made some key improvements. He went from one of the absolute worst per game scores as far as like kick, punt, go decisions to, I think, number one in the country. So just better feels a head coach, more confidence in himself. And I think they do a solid job recruiting there at Baylor. Their talent development so far, I mean, it's only been a year, so not a huge sample set, but it's encouraging to me that they're getting a lot out of these guys. Some of them are Matt Rule's players, to be totally fair. And Rule is obviously a pretty good evaluator of talent if you look at what he did all the way back to his days at Temple. But I think I'm pretty encouraged by what Aranda's doing there right now.
He's a super cerebral dude. You know, if that's one thing. I mean, he's different. Like, you know, we see this kind of like stoic personality on the sidelines, but you know, his post game immediately on the field interview that he did after he won the Big 12 championship, they asked him how did they arrive here and what was that process like after going 2-7 last year, and he talked about being able to get out of their own way, being able to remove ego from the equation. And we've talked about this. We've talked about how big of an obstacle ego is in every football building in the country. And I think he's really good. Like he'd be a guy that I'd be super interested to see what their offseason looks like in terms of asking the right questions and where they need to improve and where they feel they need to get better. I have a ton of belief in him and a lot of confidence in him as a head coach, that he's probably one of the best in the country in terms of making adjustments in the offseason for what needs to be done for his program. He certainly did that this offseason, and Baylor's benefited in a big-time way.
For sure. All right, so pivoting from one guy who is a defensive coordinator, now a head coach, to another, let's talk a little Oklahoma, if you would. Brent Venables finally decides to come home. They have quite the challenge there right now. They're moving into the SEC. Texas and Texas A&M are recruiting extremely well, really got those NIL programs ramped up to the max, which we'll talk about here in a moment. I guess on the encouraging side, Venables is one of like the best defensive coaches of our generation, bar none. The guy just, they routinely recruit well and then outplay their recruiting rankings as well, consistently. And that's even on the opponent adjusted stuff, right? Sometimes they play in a weaker ACC and they still crush that. They did get torched by Joe Burrow in the bowl game, but also everybody else did as well that year. That was just kind of a special LSU team. Defense carried Clemson this year as their offense struggled. The thing I'm most encouraged about is if the reports are accurate and they're able to follow through on it, he seems to be following the same path that Bob Stoops did. So Stoops was the DC at Florida under Spurrier, and Spurrier told him, hey, hire the offensive coordinator who gives you fits. And that offensive coordinator was named Mike Leach at Kentucky. And that's exactly who Bob Stoops went and got. And 2 years later, he won a national title at Oklahoma. I think if you're a defensive coach, it's really important that you push your boundaries and you hire somebody who can go out there and get you points. Your job as a defensive, minded coach, hey, if the offense puts my defense in a bad situation, we're going to be good enough to overcome that situation, right? Like, I'm going to make sure my defense is damn good. We're going to give that offense every opportunity. That's one thing I actually think Jimbo does pretty well, by the way, is giving the defensive side of the ball more scholarships and more resources to make sure they could get it right. I know Mark Stoops, when he was Jimbo's DC in 2010 and 2011, was very appreciative of that. And so the reports out there that he's likely to hire Jeff Lebby, who is Lane Kiffin's OC, was at Baylor, was at UCF as well. A guy who's very like wide open offense. They score a ton of points. That's not a move that all defensive coordinator turned head coaches would make, because they can put your defense in some tough situations that you're going to have to bail yourself out of. But I think it kind of maximizes your efficiency on both sides. If you are kind of, I don't say man enough, but if you're comfortable enough with how your defense is going to perform, that you can handle it, it can really work.
Yeah. I like that. I mean, I think it's a move that Oklahoma has to make if they can go out there and get Jeff Lebby. I think with everything that they have on that roster right now, there's a lot of, from a personnel standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of guys that would fit Jeff Lebby's system. Talk about Caleb Williams, being able to keep him in the boat and keep him happy. I think that would do the job. And I think Brent Venables, coming from Clemson, has the blueprint and truly understands what it looks like from a team complementary standpoint, and he's going to have that defense playing strong from a personnel and talent acquisition standpoint. I think Clemson defensively always did a really good job in the talent evaluation aspect of finding guys who fit their defense. It's going to be something to watch to see if Brent Venables can replicate that at Oklahoma. Where is he going to get that size from on the defensive front? But you've already kind of seen him, on the recruiting trail already, some guys that they're picking up some momentum with that kind of fit what he wants to do. I think he's all about scheme versatility and having guys that are multiple on defense. So Oklahoma, if they can improve defensively, stay the course, which is a very high standard for what they've done offensively in the past, they're going to be a team is definitely fun to watch, and a team to continue to monitor. They're my biggest question mark right now, and it's not so much about Brent Venables. It's just you're going a completely different direction from Lincoln Riley, which was very successful. So to kind of flip that on its head is definitely going to be something that, I can't wait to see going forward, because watching Brent Venables in his first interview when he got off the private plane in Oklahoma, like, he reminded me of Sam Pittman. Here's a guy that's had a lot of opportunities to go a lot of different places as a defense coordinator and as a head coach, and has been a big part of that success at Clemson and that continuity that Dabo Swinney's had. And for him, obviously, this has been the one that he's been waiting on. And you could tell how passionate he was about the University of Oklahoma. And I think there's something about that's just really hard to factor into this whole process. And I think we saw that with Sam Pittman in Arkansas. I expect Brent Venables to have the same type of effect on Oklahoma.
I totally agree with that. It's not a guarantee. Scott Frost, Nebraska, Willie Taggart, Florida State, either played for, grew up, huge fans of those programs. Obviously, Venables having coached there and having lived a good portion of his life there, that familiarity is definitely not a negative. There are certain things that you could just step in if you're a first-year head coach at a place that you're not familiar with. Obviously, Cristobal to Miami is another example of this. You're just going to know intrinsically certain things that you can or can't do there. And that is certainly an advantage. We'll see how he runs his recruiting operation. Clemson was pretty unique in how they did there. It's like they don't recruit the exact same way that a Bama or a Georgia or an Ohio State or an A&M does. They're very picky about who they offer. And I just kind of stopped saying it because I looked like an idiot after a while. It's like, there's no way this hit rate is sustainable. Like, their hit rate on guys is crazy higher than you would expect it to be, as far as, percentage of X number or, X rating guys drafted and where they're drafted and number of all conference players and whatnot. I still think it's a little unsustainable what they do. Like, I don't know if you can consistently be beaten out by some of those schools like that and always do that. But we'll see how much of that he carries over. I expect him to have a pretty damn good defense. Alex Grinch was already making real strides there with that defense, I think. And then, of course, we'll see how they do with NIL here, which is the question I want to take here early in the chat. Really appreciate you guys jumping in early. Make sure you're giving us that thumbs up on the YouTube page, especially if you're in the chat there. But we're going to reward somebody for jumping in the chat early, almost as soon as we started. And this question is from Baucomville. And he asks, what impact will NIL have on the way programs approach recruiting? It seems like college athletic funds are being used to essentially buy players. Oh, never. This, along with the new transfer rule, changes everything. And because it's covering up our faces, I'm going to pull the question down. Coop, so NIL and recruiting. We don't necessarily have to get into specifics here. We did see that Texas announced that there's $50,000 guaranteed to each offensive lineman on scholarship for them through the Pancake Collective or something like that. It's some kind of thing for charity. Obviously, Bama has the Mercedes deal. Texas A&M has outrageous NIL funds right now that are still waiting to be used. Apparently, they ended up landing from Oklahoma. It's a nice transition. So Gabriel, Brownlow, Dendy, really elite level defensive lineman here in the state of Florida. Pretty freaky athlete. Great balance for his size. He ends up flipping from OU to Texas A&M. So if you're in a recruiting office right now, obviously you can't tell kids like, hey, we'll give you X if you sign legally, although I'm very confident that does happen across the sport. Like, if you're competitive, that's kind of happening. But how are you factoring in NIL into your recruiting pitch?
I mean, it's a big piece. I mean, you're just trying to ask the right questions in terms of what are the gray areas and how do we exploit this in our advantage. And I think you've seen Texas A&M, as you've mentioned, Alabama already. I would expect them to be at the forefront of anything that happens in college football. But this is certainly already playing a factor in the talent acquisition phase of college football. And I think as people and programs start to understand more of the boundaries of it and what they can actually do and in different ways that they can actually exploit it, I think you're only going to see this dramatically change college football for what it is. I mean, $50,000 is a lot of money, in especially for somebody in the range of 18 to 21 years old. And over 4 years, it's $200,000. So it's definitely money that's going to make you reconsider wherever you are in that process. But I think the majority of these programs and these schools and these universities are in the evaluation phase of this, and usually it's a piggyback league. We know that, and you talk about the names that are the ones leading the charge here. It's no surprise. So I think as those guys continue to go into deeper waters in this, and you see the benefit of these NIL programs, more teams, more programs, more universities are going to find themselves involved in this.
I am interested. Is there a school, and so far I haven't really found one, but is there a school out there that is not a traditional recruiting power at the very top who can parlay NIL into a massive recruiting bump? Like, to me, we can put these names out there. These schools are obviously spending a lot of money in NIL once the guys get on campus. I'm not going to accuse anybody of, telling kids, hey, if you sign here, I'll give you this, other than like the obvious ones where it's guaranteed to every player at a certain position. However, all of the schools that we're mentioning are already the schools that were badass recruiters before NIL. If you read Stephen Godfrey's Meet the Bagman piece or watch the movie he made, like it's not new. Like, resources have a way, not necessarily from coaching staffs, of finding the way to players pretty consistently. But it doesn't mean that is the only factor that matters. At a certain point, all of the teams will be somewhat in the same ballpark. And recruiting relationships, location, rate of putting players into the NFL, history of success with a certain position, all that stuff, that is not going to ever not matter, right? And unless somebody's out there offering $1 million guaranteed and everybody else is sitting there at 75,000, okay, well, you may see some kids commit to the worst coach in the world or something like that for that difference. I just don't think we're going to see that big of a discrepancy between the top teams. And so I do think those recruiting relationships will still continue to matter a whole lot. It's not just whoever offers the biggest check gets it. That's not the way it works in any other free agency thing either.
Yeah, but it's not too dissimilar to what we're talking about with Oregon and Miami. You just want to make sure you're checking that box, and then all else equal, you want to give yourself the best opportunity to acquire that talent. So I look at some places, and I think there's a lot of programs on the West Coast that can certainly benefit from this. I look at the University of Washington in a city like Seattle, and you look at all the tech opportunities in a place like Seattle. I don't know if businesses in Seattle are thinking that way. It's kind of like a catch-22, because you go out to the University of Washington and you go out to the Pac-12 conference. Football is not viewed the same way as it's viewed in the South. Listen to the programs that we're talking about, right? Texas A&M, Alabama, but I think programs in cities alike that are in a position to capitalize on business opportunities. I think about Austin, Texas. Like, Texas, in my opinion, should be leading the charge on everything from name, image, and likeness. You look at Palo Alto and Stanford and all the tech companies there, Facebook, Google, so on and so forth. So I do think there are unique ways to package this with those universities. And if I'm somebody at that university, I'm reaching out to all these businesses and trying to get them involved with what we're doing.
I mean, I think the same thing about Northwestern and Chicago, right? Like, if you should be able to up your recruiting a little bit with the amount of super rich alumni they put out, with the huge city of Chicago there and all the business connections that you have. I mean, it's positive. It's really positive publicity there for these businesses. The other thing I want to point out, and I talked to somebody about this last night, just because the school is not publicizing it does not necessarily mean that they are not engaged in NIL stuff. I know, like, you might say, why would they not want to publicize it? Not every program out there is in like a measuring contest, like appears to be going on between Texas and Texas A&M. Right? If they have a new NIL thing, they shout it from the rooftops. But not every school is doing that. I guarantee you, the other SEC powers are actively working on NIL stuff, quite a bunch. I do have a correction to make, apparently, from the comment section. Satake reached out to OU, not the other way around. Apparently, it was misreported last night and since corrected. So I apologize for passing it on. I should have verified that before the show started. But I do think that there are other schools that are doing similarly to what A&M and Texas are doing. They're just not necessarily broadcasting it every day because they're not really in competition with a rival to see who can look more committed.
I do think this is it's the discovery phase of all this, right? Like, I mean, look at the transfer portal. There's just kind of like this wait and see. Now look at it a couple years down the line. Like what are we, year 2, year 3 of the transfer portal?
Year 2 of the I think year 3 of the portal, but year 2 of the no sit out rule.
Right, immediate eligibility, right? And look at those numbers and how they've increased. I mean, we're talking about over 300 players at the FBS level now in the transfer portal. And as compared to last year, I don't have the exact numbers, but I would guess to say that that's seen a dramatic increase. So now that's kind of what I see. I don't see as much people. I think it's more wait and see mode from a lot of these universities and a lot of these programs and administrators. How do they want to incorporate their strategy into their recruiting plan? And I think they're still feeling that out. Now, there's always going to be the handful of programs and organizations around the country that are going to jump in head first, and we've seen that from the schools that we've talked about here.
One thing I do think is interesting, Coop, and I wanted to run this by you, something I was kicking around yesterday. When will we reach equilibrium as far as transfers for high schools? Like, I know a lot of coaches out there at the high school level hate this transfer portal stuff because they're saying, hey, like my kid who I feel is like a college level player who I've done this for 20 years normally would have offers or better offers or more of them right now, and he simply doesn't. And they're blaming the portal. What I think it actually is the newness of the portal is certainly attractive. If you're a coach who needs to win now, you're going to go to the portal. But one thing I want to point out here, guys, is that we are still very much as a sport under the 85 versus COVID crunch. So last year, when the NCAA passed the rule that said basically to get guys to play because they were worried about losing a year of eligibility if they played during the COVID season, they said, hey, everybody gets a free year of eligibility. That's great. And for this season, those guys did not count against the 85 scholarship cap if you were a quote-unquote super senior or COVID senior. Next year, they count against the 85 cap. The year after, they count against the 85 cap. The year after that, they count against the 85 cap. So to me, I think we have an issue here, and it's because a lot of the schools that are not maybe your top 10 or 15 schools out there didn't want to continue to fund 100 football scholarships as opposed to 85 and fund extra scholarships in every other sport. So what we're seeing here, and I think we will continue to see for 2 more seasons until these COVID seniors cycle out, is a roster crunch. Schools have to get down to 85. Just because you're guaranteed an extra year, that don't mean you're guaranteed it here, right? You can use it if you can find somebody to take you, and the schools do not have to guarantee you that year. So we're seeing more and more guys who actually can play a little bit flood into the portal because of this roster crunch. We basically have 5 years worth of players because of the NCAA's ruling crunched into a 4-year typical cycle capped roster of 85. So if you're a high school coach out there, I would say this is certainly a problem. I would expect the problem to continue for 2 more years. Once we wash out these COVID seniors or super seniors to use the term, I think we will probably reach a bit of an equilibrium, right? To where we go back to a little more high school because we're not having quite the roster crunch.
Yeah. And I know we've talked about this before. It's super interesting. I can imagine people in the positions that I used to be in, obviously pulling their hair out right now, trying to figure this out in terms of moving guys off the roster. I mean, that was one of the first thoughts that crossed my mind when I was in it is like, I can't believe we're going to give these guys another year. Not to mention the guys already on the roster who aren't seniors are getting another year of eligibility as well. So there's definitely going to be a lot of navigating to try to balance this out. And like you said, until these guys have exhausted their eligibility as super seniors, it's going to be more difficult. But in terms of, reaching the equilibrium, I think it's just going to depend really on philosophy of each coach. I think a lot of people look at the transfer portal and they look at it maybe in one way. How do I acquire top end talent? I don't think a lot of teams are using it to shore up their too deep, or maybe look for special teams contributors, guys that are a little bit more proven than maybe taking a chance on a guy out of high school that you're tied into for 4 years. So I think as we get more into the transfer portal era, I think you'll start to see some changes in philosophy in terms of how people really approach how they can address immediate and long-term needs and roster construction over time with the transfer portal. I know a lot of teams now are starting to ask these questions. I think Ole Miss did a really good job of this. Analyzing where do we need to improve going into the season? What's the thing that keeps you up at night? Hey, I really like our starting five on our offensive line, but hey, if something happens to our center, that throws some off, right? Like, we're looking at Clemson, and it's kind of fascinating to think about Dabo and his stance on the portal. But you look at Clemson and what they had to do from an offensive line standpoint this year, moving Bockhorst around. Jordan McFadden's got to move from right tackle to left tackle. These aren't easy transitions for these players. So those questions remain. Are you in a better spot going into the portal and getting a guy that's had 2 years of experience that will come in here and be your starting left tackle? That way you can keep the continuity of that position room. So I think those questions now are going to be things that teams and administrators and people behind the scenes are going to focus on. Hey, how do we put our guys in the best position to win? And that might not necessarily mean by filling a hole. But if we get into a situation in the middle of the year where we find ourselves in a jam, we want to make sure that this team can keep rowing in the right direction. Like, I remember the Anthony Brown conversation. It was Tyler Shuck and it was Anthony Brown. And it wasn't necessarily to bring Anthony Brown in as a starter. We were just very confident that we had a playoff caliber team. And for us, there was a big drop off in terms of going between Tyler Shuck and the next guy being a true freshman. So how do you instill confidence in your team going into the season that, hey, if something happens at this position, we don't really have an insurance policy. So I think you'll start to see more teams approaching it that way, and how they want to shore up their 53 to 57 really active players throughout the year, instead of saying, hey, let's go acquire one of the top end guys that's hit the portal.
This is, I think, very similar compared to what we see in baseball free agency, right? It's not just let's go sign the best guy out there. Certainly, if you can and you have a spot for him, makes sense, you do it. But the guys who always get a lot more money than people realize are the starting pitcher, who are not going to be at your first or second or maybe even third best starter, but the guy who can be your fourth or fifth swing guy who you're confident can throw you 170 innings. I mean, that's 500 outs right there that you can now account for, who won't kill you if he has to become your number three. That using the portal to acquire depth is a really big advantage if you can pull it off. The tricky part there is finding a guy who you think, if he had to go into the starting lineup, wouldn't kill you, but also won't be a culture problem if he doesn't start for you. I mean, I know that conversation is had with a lot of guys I know at different programs. Like, yeah, we like him, but he's kind of a diva. Like, what if he comes here and he doesn't start for us? Is he going to bounce before the end of fall camp? What happens then? And then we've wasted a spot. So finding that right fit is a great idea, and certainly one that staffs are striving for. There are some challenges, though, that make it a little bit harder than you might think from the outside.
Well, it's like a salary cap too, right? Like, okay, it's opportunity cost. How, right? There's some questions about the character, if the fit isn't correct, but we like the upside of the player and where he can contribute. But if it doesn't go wrong, what is this going to look like? Well, he's only on the books for 1 year.
Right. So
if that's the case, if he leaves, we get that scholarship right back, right? So what does that investment and that turnaround time kind of look like? But, there's a report out today from our very own Chris Hummer about Elias Ricks and about Ohio State backing out of the race because they're worried about the perception of that room and what that would do to the dichotomy of that room, which I think is super fascinating. Like, there is a psychological part where you have to be tied into your program and the feel of your program, and not only how it affects maybe the bottom line, but how is it going to affect some of these guys that you've recruited out of high school where you told that they were going to have ample opportunity to play and develop, and they've waited their turn. And now all of a sudden you're bringing in another guy off the streets to arguably compete for their position. So I think the messaging, even throughout the high school recruiting process, is important because it has to be consistent with who you are in terms of acquiring talent through the portal as well. And you'll see a lot of coaches talk about this as, hey, we want to create competition at every position, and that's what this is about. But I mean, these decisions, there's a lot more than meets the eye in terms of, hey, we just want to upgrade our roster.
No doubt about it. All right. What do we have in the chat here? We have a lot of arguing if Lincoln Riley's a good head coach. I think we both agree that he's done a pretty nice job there at Oklahoma. Let me see. Venables, did he actually do a good job at Clemson this year because they went 9-3? I think if you didn't have Venables this year, you might have gone like 7-5, y'all. Like that defense really carried that offense. I was actually talking to a buddy of mine who does analytics, and he's like, yeah, Clemson's offense this year is like causing me to go back and look at my methodology to see just what the right amount of priors to keep in to a power rating formula, because in previous years they've been so good. And we do know that like evaluating priors and keeping them in a formula does make it more accurate, but outliers sometimes can really bite you if the numbers just really never catch up to that. Cuba, I got a question for you. I don't know if you know the answer to this. I certainly didn't. Can you go in the portal and still play in the bowl game?
I don't know the answer to that one.
Because I'm a little confused by this. Western Kentucky's number one most explosive receiver, Mitchell Tinsley, hit the portal, but there's a report out as well from, I think, the local paper there. It says Western Kentucky confirmed this news. I'm told he plans on playing in the bowl game. I thought once you're in the portal, I'm unclear on that.
What I would imagine his case is he plans on playing in the bowl game and then putting his name in the portal after the game. That's what I would imagine. I have no facts on that. If he's actually in the portal now,
yeah, he's definitely like in. Like we
don't.
They have to report.
They have to withdraw his financial aid, which then I wouldn't see a way for him to be active during that game.
That's what I was thinking too. I'm going to dig on this a little more. That's an interesting case. Obviously, if he's out, I like App State's chances a little bit better in that game, considering he went for what was it? Yeah, 12.8 yards per target. That's pretty good on the year. Cool, buddy. About an hour, and really appreciate everybody joining us in the chat. If you guys haven't given us that nice 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, please do. I was looking at our numbers this year. On the audio side, we're up 88% year over year, so that's pretty solid growth. Certainly, some of that is just having more stuff to talk about without COVID this year. But a lot of that's y'all really appreciating you just diehard listenership and the audience, and we've more than doubled the channel subscribers in the last 3 months. So things are going well here on Cover 3, and that's really it's a credit to y'all in the audience for sticking with us. We know you got a lot of choices, and we appreciate y'all making us your top choice. Do it again next week, or well, maybe not. We got signing day next week. Let's figure that out. You may be traveling.
Yes, that is true. I mean, we can do it. I'll be
maybe live from
on Tuesday. I'll be good.
Are you going to be to Lauderdale on Tuesday?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. I will.
First time on TV next week. I love the whole approach of like, hey, no, you haven't been on TV, but we're going to put you on a 5-hour signing day show. We'll see how you do.
This is. I mean, you own a suit?
Yeah.
You know which camera to look at?
No.
There's a little light on top that'll show you which one is active. Just look for the light.
I think Pate's going to be on there too.
And you'll have an IFB in the ear, and they'll tell you like, hey, Cooper, you're looking at camera 1, but we're actually on camera 4.
I don't even know what an IFB is, so that's great.
Yeah, I actually don't know what the abbreviation is. It's got the little elastic cord on there, and you clip it to the back of your jacket, and then they'll.
There we go.
Are you doing makeup?
I don't know.
I don't think I
need it. Maybe
you got to talk to them about your lighting situation, beforehand, and see if you can get the stash clear.
Going Hollywood, baby. Yeah,
no doubt. Awesome, dude. All right, I'll see you on the flip.
All right, man.